again, class. This worked pretty well last time. One of your professors here, along with Dr. Matarese, Eric Bruns. And yeah, week 3, I gave a lecture that gave an overview of the practice model. This time around, we're looking at the research based on wraparound. So we're getting now even more into the head, so to speak. If we think about wraparound as trying to bring together the head and the heart, what does research say about working with children and families, as well as what do we know is going to actually resonate with them, allow us to engage with them, those stories from Carl and Ira's book. If that's the heart, we're really into the head now. We're going to talk about research on wraparound. You have a few articles to read. My summary today is going to give us a little bit of more detail and try to weave all of those readings that you have for this week together into one cohesive story. And you should watch this lecture because somewhere along the way I'm going to try and come up with something that I want you to post in your discussion board this week for an extra credit point. Okay, so there's a little clue for you to watch till the end, because we're not 100% sure always if people are doing all the assignments. This will be maybe one way to do so. So today we're going to talk about basic research that informs wraparound. What is it that we know about humans and teams and how humans work together in child development that has led to our theory of action, which you have seen in a couple of different ways thus far in this course. The theory of action informs the practice model that we talked about in week 3. Then we're going to talk about the thing that so many policymakers and providers out there want to know, which is what are the outcomes of wraparound? If we invest in this model, are we actually going to get better outcomes for kids? Are we going to get better outcomes for the system, including fewer kids in institutions and less money being spent on those kinds of residential placements? And then finally, something that's a little bit overlooked over the years, has been overlooked over the years, which is how do we make sure wraparound is actually done well out there? How do we achieve adherence and quality, adherence to the prescribed model and quality implementation? And what are the implications if we don't achieve that kind of quality wraparound implementation? What happens to outcomes? And how can we make sure that outcomes are as positive as we want them to be? So here's, in a nutshell, the main points that I'm going to cover over the course of the next 30 or 40 minutes. First of all, wraparound is really grounded on basic research, on teamwork, on child development, on family relations, and just human nature. And basic research informs the wraparound theory of change, as well as the practice model. The third point that you should just take away from this and have a lot of talking points about is that outcomes from controlled studies really do indicate wraparound's positive effects. And outcomes from system studies show how much wraparound can change systems of care from being overly invested in institutional care to really flipping the triangle and getting us more to community-based care for children with complex needs in their families. The implication there is lower costs for that 2 to 5% of children who are experiencing the most complex needs. And then finally, research on wraparound implementation really does tell us what we need to focus on in supporting wraparound implementation. And that research informs the training and coaching that we do in states and communities with hundreds of providers serving thousands of children and families. So let's start from the top. What's the basic idea here? Why do we think wraparound works better? What basic research is involved in or was drawn from in creating the wraparound process and practice model? So we think that wraparound works better because it provides a structured approach to overcoming system barriers, and it's using core elements that are based on basic research. So that's why we think wraparound works better. It provides for a systematic mechanism for mobilizing things that we think get to better teamwork, better plans of care, families and youth who are better engaged in services. What we know from what we've done thus far in the course is that wraparound creates possibilities. Possibilities to view alternative ways of organizing systems to provide help. So you saw how we're going from a fragmented approach to care to one where the youth and family are at the center of the planning process, and that systems are not driving the process. Ideally, families and youth needs are. Similarly, Wraparound creates possibilities to partner with families in a different way by, in fact, providing an individual, like a facilitator or care coordinator, whose job it will be to bring the systems together on behalf of those families and actually dedicate the time necessary to engage with them and find out what their real deep needs are. Look beyond behaviors to more holistic and deep needs. Move from professional-driven services to plans of care that actually represent creative ways of bringing the system and the family's natural and community supports together to deliver strategies that have the capacity to work. Focusing on the youth in the context of home, school, and community, and include non-traditional helpers in the process. We've already heard all of those things. But where do we get the basic, what is the status of basic research that says that we should do these kinds of things in our service delivery? Well, research on teamwork tells us that team success, and this is research not from human services, but research from industrial and organizational psychology as much as anything. Our research that we've reviewed on teamwork is, to some extent, it's common sense. But we are applying this research in the way in which we're training and coaching our facilitators to bring children and families' teams together. Research on teamwork suggests that team success is more likely when there's an overall long-term goal or mission. Thus, the practice model for Wraparound asks that we pull together a mission statement for the team and also a vision statement for the family. Both of those are instrumental in keeping teams on track in Wraparound, and it's based on research and teamwork that says that those things lead to better team success. A second piece of research on teamwork says that there are clearly defined intermediate goals, that you're not just putting out there a long-term goal and hoping you can find a way there. And so this research really does direct us in Wraparound to make sure that there are strategies that have short-term goals that are achievable as you try to work towards that long-term vision for the family. Research on teamwork tells us that multiple options are generated to try to solve problems, which is exactly what we hope and instruct our care coordinators and family partners to do with the team that convenes in planning meetings. Generate multiple options before you select one. Other things that are really critical in research on teamwork are that team members all share their individual goals. You have shared expectations for how the team process will work, which again, we expect our facilitators to do with the team that is convened. And the big one, as you know from the last lecture from my standpoint, is that you're setting clear goals and you're monitoring progress and reviewing that progress. This is essential to effective teamwork regardless of whether you're working on designing a building, coming up with an ad campaign, or working in a Wraparound team. Now, you remember that the first principle of Wraparound is voice and choice. So what's different in Wraparound? We have a team. The team meets regularly, and the family's voice and choice is paramount in determining what the strategies will be in the plan of care and what the goals will be. This is very straightforward, and again, it's very commonsensical. People who feel like they choose an activity or an option are more committed and have more success. And people who feel included in a decision-making process are much more likely to follow through. We're trying to get to the point where we're reducing the barriers, the emotional barriers and the logistical barriers, to parents actually doing the strategies that are in their plan of care. And Wraparound is intended to do that both by addressing those barriers head on, but by also putting the decision-making power into the family's hands about what those strategies will be. Research on strengths. Reframing and taking a strength-based approach to behaviors is not just a good idea or a compassionate idea. It helps family members and team members to realize that behavior is changeable or malleable. There is basic research on this stuff. Being strengths-based increases the motivation to address behaviors. instead of pushing away the helpers who may be so often, even when they're well-meaning, primarily talking about problems, diagnoses, or deficits. Strengths, focus, and service is associated with greater social support and greater feelings of optimism and empowerment. It really upsets me when I hear service providers disparaging the idea that we're going to be strengths-based. They say things like, this is going to, we have a problem to deal with here. There's a real diagnosis here. There are real crises going on here. We can't just go around talking about strengths. Well, of course you need to get down to the nitty-gritty of what we're coming together to try to solve in terms of problems. But if you're not actually acknowledging, listing, reinforcing, and making a plan based on strengths, you're very likely to not have a family who's going to be engaged in the process. And that's not going to help them at all. Focusing on priority needs is also something that's based in some basic research. It increases our perceptions of relevance, which increases motivation and outcomes. So if you're actually ensuring that the needs that you're focusing on are in the family's words and are from their own hearts and minds, it's more likely that people will be motivated to work on those. And finally, all of these things, active participation, making choices, experiencing success, leads to greater self-efficacy. Self-efficacy means basically that an individual feels like they can accomplish something. They have an internal sense that something is worth taking on because they will be likely to succeed. And if you don't have that self-efficacy, it's less likely that you're going to generate optimism about the future. Self-efficacy is associated with greater follow-through, greater optimism, less depression, and greater social support. So all of these things, and social support, building in natural supports and community supports into the team process leads directly, not just indirectly, but to greater morale, better health, better coping, and recovery from mental illness. We know this from basic research in social services. So what does all of this basic research lead us to in terms of our theory for the wraparound process and what the outcomes will be? Well, we've seen this before, but if we indeed implement an effective, values-based team approach that is guided by the phases and activities of wraparound as well as the 10 principles, we believe that we'll get to a high-fidelity, high-quality wraparound process that ensures that the services that are in the plan work better for the family and that the family will, in fact, feel more optimistic, feel greater social support. This is an independent route to positive outcomes, okay? Participation in wraparound builds family assets and capacities independent of the service plan being more tailored to their needs and more likely to be followed through. Our sense here is that, again, optimism can be built, greater health, greater morale, all of those things, a feeling of belongingness in the community, an understanding that we as a family can solve our problems. All of that stuff is achieved by having a team come together and do these kinds of activities. So we think that there are these two routes to positive child, youth, and family outcomes. So here's my place that I want you to reference in your discussion board at some point. In your discussion this week, we asked you to imagine designing a research study of your own that might answer a question that you have about wraparound, the wraparound process, wraparound outcomes, whatever. I'm going to give you a bonus point if you reference the theory of change in your description of the research study that you want to design, okay? So remember that. You're going to get a bonus point if you reference the theory of change. Here is a more detailed version of that theory of change. What does it say? Again, if we in fact implement the phases and activities of wraparound, if we stay true to the 10 principles, here are some of the things that happen, and you already know these things. The youth and family will drive the goal setting. There will be one service plan, not 10. There will be active integration of natural supports, and the family will receive social support from those folks at a higher level. There will be more opportunities for choice and voice among the family. We're going to actively evaluate and track progress, and we're going to celebrate successes. Those are just examples of things that happen in model adherent wraparound. Well, what does that lead to? In the short term, for all the reasons I already discussed, better engagement in services, so family members who really feel like they're going to actually follow through on the strategies in the plan, showing up for therapy appointments and so forth. Creative plans that fit the needs of youth and families. So not only are they engaged, the plans are actually likely to lead to positive outcomes because they actually are fit to the family's real needs. Sometimes we take services right off the shelf and plug them into the family or the youth without asking, is this actually the most important thing we can be working on right now? If you're working on school behavior as the primary thing in a plan without recognizing that the reason that the young person is coming to school very anxious and depressed because of things happening at home, it's not likely that that plan is actually fitting the needs that will get us to positive outcomes. So if we do these things, we're going to better engage the families, they're going to follow through more, we're going to have a plan that actually fits the needs more fully and get to better outcomes, as we'll see. Better coordination of care, better follow through on the team decisions, not just by the family, but by the members of that team. And the family is going to regularly experience success and support. Just by being in that team process, they're going to experience success. They're going to experience more optimism about the future, perhaps less stress, because they know there are people that they might be able to turn to. So here are our two paths at a bigger, more detail. So more effective services, so the families will participate in services more actively, and the services are going to work better for the family. They're going to be more appropriate. And here's all of the ways in which we think that families' assets will be built independent of the service plan. They're going to achieve the team's goals. They're going to experience increased social support. They're going to have improved coping and problem solving. They're going to have greater optimism about the future as they see things actually succeeding, as you're celebrating success, as you're tracking progress, as people are actually coming together in a coordinated way. It's going to lead to enhanced self-esteem and self-efficacy. And it's these two things together, better services that are actually followed through on and increased family assets, that get us to these extremely important long-term outcomes. That youth are at home, their mental health is improving, their school and community functioning is improving, and the family has a more higher quality of life. Okay, so remember, this is the detailed theory of change. When you're referencing the research study you want to design, reference the theory of change in some way. Put some sort of specific mechanism, or at least reference the theory in some way to get a bonus point for your discussion this week. Okay, so now we've talked about the first 2 points of this week's lecture. What are those 2 points? Take a second to think about what they are. First, that basic research underlies the wraparound process. And second, that we can design a theory of change and a practice model based on that basic research. So now we're to the third point this week, which is, what are the outcomes of wraparound? Does wraparound work? Which outcomes that are proposed on this theory seem to get, for which of these outcomes do we get the best effects? And for whom? For which kids? And what leads to positive outcomes? So at this point, actually this slide is a little bit out of date. At this point we have 11 controlled studies of wraparound. What's a controlled study? Do you know what a controlled study is? Think about that for 1 second. Controlled study means that that there's some mechanism through which you are comparing outcomes for one group that actually gets the targeted intervention compared to a similar second group that did not get that intervention, but for whom the individuals are similar. Okay, so that's the control or the comparison study we're talking about. So we actually have 11 studies at this point. This slide refers to 9, and this is in your reading for this week, is a summary of these different studies. One thing you might notice is that the target populations or the systems in which these studies have been done, we don't have any in schools yet. They've all been done in mental health, child welfare, and juvenile justice settings. We're just now beginning to get to some controlled studies on school-based wraparound. Over here you'll see the type of design that was used, and one thing you'll see here is that there are only 3 studies that are randomized control studies. Randomized control studies are kind of the gold standard for research studies that are comparing one intervention to business as usual. It means that not only are the 2 groups equivalent, but they've been made equivalent by essentially flipping a coin to decide which individual goes to which condition. So there's actually been 2 more that have been published in the last few years. So we have 11 wraparound controlled studies at this point. And I'm not going to get into the details here because you have your readings to get to that'll explain the full picture from each of those studies. But overall, what we know from our meta-analysis and our reviews is that in general, these controlled studies show better functioning and mental health outcomes for the wraparound groups, reduced recidivism, which means reoffending for juvenile justice involved youth, increased rates of case closure for child welfare involved youth, and that's a very small number of studies that have looked at that, but we have seen that. And the biggest thing that we see most consistently, and this is to some extent because we have a lot of interest out there in tracking costs of services, is reduction in costs associated with residential placements. That's the most consistent and strong finding from wraparound. Its ability to keep kids in home and community-like settings and saving the system's money as a result by reducing the reliance on residential placements that could cost as much as $150,000, $200,000 per year. So here's just some examples from one study of the types of outcomes that we see. So this is from a sample of mental health of youth in a child welfare system who have complex mental health needs. This was done in Nevada. It was a relatively small matched comparison study with about 30 youth in wraparound compared to 30 youth receiving services as usual. And so what you see is traditional mental health services. This is talking about the number of youth out of 30 that were in, that after 1 year were in more restrictive placements is the blue, placements that were similar in restrictiveness compared to baseline in the yellow, and the number of youth who were in less restrictive placements, so they might have moved from a group home to foster care or from foster care back home to their family. That's what this is showing. And so look at, what do you see here in this graph? Take a moment and tell yourself, scribble down on a piece of paper what it is you see. The wraparound group here, the traditional mental health or comparison group here. Well, 27 of the wraparound youth out of about 33 were in less restrictive placements a year after the start of the study. Whereas for the traditional mental health group, there was actually more youth in the same level of residential restrictiveness or even more restrictive settings as moved to less restrictive, more community-like settings. Over here you see a functioning measure or a trend line for a functioning measure that was assessed at 6 months, 12 months, and 18 months after enrollment in either wraparound or treatment as usual, traditional mental health. So what you see is the wraparound group here is showing a big decline, nearly 40 points in their functional impairment as assessed by the Child and Adolescent Functional Assessment Scale. Whereas traditional mental health youth were basically at the same level of functioning at 18 months as they were when they got into services. So a huge difference in how much improvement in their functioning in the community, homeschool and community occurred from a standardized measure. Here's a summary of results from a juvenile justice study of wraparound. 110 youth who were in a program called Connections that was wraparound based. who had committed offenses previously, they were 3 times less likely to commit their felony offense a year later compared to a group of 98 youth who they were compared to who didn't have access to the Connections program. 3 times less likely to offend for those youth that were enrolled in this program. And for those who did offend, it was on average 3 times longer after enrollment in the program compared to the non-Connections group. And they also showed significant improvement in their behavioral and emotional problems. Overall, so those are just 2 of the 9 studies that are summarized in your reading. If you look at a meta-analysis, which basically combines the results of all of the studies that we have access to, and looks at the average effect between the treatment group and the comparison group, which in this case is Wraparound versus whatever the comparison groups were in the studies, these are the effect sizes that we find. 0 means there's no difference between groups. If you're up here at, let's take a look here. A 0.8 effect size means a very large average difference between the 2 groups. A 0.5 effect size means a medium-sized effect, and a 0.2 sized effect is considered significant but small. So take a look at this slide. Tell me what you see here, or I should say, think about what you see here. What does it look to you as though across these 4 types of outcomes, community functioning, juvenile justice outcomes, school functioning, and living environment, for which of these things will we expect Wraparound to have the biggest effect if we implement it in our community? You probably have already figured out that it's the living environment's outcome. That's a medium-sized effect. All of these effects are significant. They mean that across the 10 studies that were in the meta-analysis, or 9 studies, all of these outcomes for Wraparound were better than services as usual. Living environment is the one that stands out as the largest effect that we can have out there in Wraparound, which is interesting, but probably not surprising. Wraparound is explicitly about supporting the family to be able to have the tools necessary to care for a young person at home. If you read the chapters that Carl and Ira wrote, so much about it is about trying to make sure that those kids were at home, in school, and out of trouble. Not necessarily that they were having mental health functioning that was better. So much about what we do in Wraparound is about recognizing that these young people are going to have some degree of problems, but we're going to support the family to take care of them no matter what. So again, a significant small to medium-sized effect for mental health, school, and community outcomes, with the average effect size about the same as about 0.35. And that's about the same as for evidence-based mental health therapies that we find out there in the community. So Wraparound is holding its own in terms of the size of effect that research shows that it has on some of these types of outcomes. So what does that mean for Wraparounds, for people's interest in implementing Wraparound? Well, Wraparound is increasingly considered evidence-based, and it's being listed in more and more inventories of evidence-based practices, including the SAMHSA National Registry of Effective Programs and Practices. It's being reviewed right now. It has been listed in several states, inventories of effective practices, which for those states, and there's not many of them, that actually have their own inventories of effective practices that systems and providers are supposed to invest in. Oregon, California, Washington, it elevates them to those practices to a higher level. So we're about 10 minutes from being done with our lecture here. What we're going to talk about in these last 10 minutes is under what conditions does it seem like research tells us we're going to be able to get those kinds of positive effects? Does that Wraparound actually work well? And what does it take, or what kind of systems and programs do we need in place to make sure we can get those positive effects? Well, let's just put it right out there, right at the start. Those are great outcomes. Those research projects that have found those positive outcomes are very, very heartening. But we also have a lot of failures out there in the community, including some that have been documented in research. Our outcomes of Wraparound depend on how well Wraparound is implemented. Studies show that Wraparound teams often fail to actually do some of the things that our theory tells us we should do. Incorporate the full complement of individuals on the Wraparound team, engage youth in community activities and things they do well, things that might help them develop friendships. We don't see Wraparound programs using family and community strengths as much as we would like them to. We don't see them engage natural supports on the team or find ways to meaningfully integrate them into the planning process or the plans themselves. Flexible funds aren't available to make sure that creative strategies can get implemented. And here's my big one, as people have probably figured out by now. We're not measuring progress or satisfaction with, by families with the process. We're not consistently assessing progress, outcomes, and satisfaction. So we're going to talk a little bit in a few weeks about how we try to ensure that those things do happen. How do we measure Wraparound quality and fidelity is going to be the topic, I think, for week 9. Our team has developed an array of different kinds of instruments, an observation measure for team meetings, something called the Wraparound Fidelity Index, which are surveys or interviews with parents and youth and team members to get their perspective on whether Wraparound is getting done as intended. A document review measure that looks at plans of care, progress notes, crisis plans, and so forth to see if Wraparound is being expressed as it's intended to in those documents. And a survey of community and system stakeholders to ask whether or not the system is actually set up to support Wraparound. We're going to learn more about these things in a few weeks. So in terms of these fidelity tools, we call these things the tools of the Wraparound Fidelity Assessment System. And what we've learned from measuring both fidelity and outcomes is that within any Wraparound initiative or program, those facilitators whose families experience better outcomes, those families tended to have staff, Wraparound staff, who were better at making those elements of the Wraparound process happen, right? They scored higher on fidelity tools. The families who got better outcomes, their providers, their staff, their facilitators, scored higher on fidelity tools. And we've also found that at the system level, or the initiative level, Wraparound initiatives that had, on average, this is kind of the flip side of the first point, if the Wraparound initiative has on average positive assessments of quality and fidelity, they tended to have more positive outcomes. The families in those programs tended to have more positive outcomes. And we'll show you a couple examples here. So there's a measure called the Child and Adolescent Needs and Strengths tool. It's basically a functioning measure for all things that might be impacting a child and family with complex needs. And what we found is that there was this relationship between the degree of fidelity as measured by our tools. So those families that experienced a high fidelity Wraparound process, 85% or better total fidelity. More than 4 out of 5, 82% of those families showed improvement on this standardized measure of functioning. If they only had adequate or borderline fidelity, that number dropped to about 2/3. So you went from over 4/5 to less than 2/3 of families getting better, or children getting better, when you drop down into this range. And for very low scoring fidelity, barely half of the children were found to get better on the Child and Adolescent Needs and Strengths. So and we've seen this kind of data come out of Wraparound programs time and time again. the degree to which we can actually adhere to a true wraparound model is going to dictate what percent of our young people and families actually achieve their vision for a more positive future. So as wraparound fidelity improves, so does improvement in youth functioning. Again, we see it time and time again. This is data from another state that shows about 8 care coordinators and what their average score was per the caregivers. So these are 8 facilitators, and the average score on the fidelity measures. You can see most of them were doing really well. We had a couple that were in the borderline range and one that had incredibly low scores. Not sure what was wrong with him or her. But what you see is this relationship. So this is, so again, these are the scores on the WFI, and this is the average improvement on another functioning scale, where the larger the number, the better the amount of improvement. And you can see that these facilitators that were getting high fidelity scores, that were adhering to the model, were getting higher, greater rates of change, larger improvement. And those that are down here, much lower, or much smaller levels of improvement. They all improved on average, but these ones are really improving a lot more. So last point here is, okay, so if we're going to make sure that we stick true to the wraparound process because we know that it's going to get us better outcomes, which are the things we really need to make sure that we do? Well, this is one of the reasons I keep hammering on setting goals and measuring progress. No matter whether you as a practitioner, an intern, a social worker, do wraparound or not, the research just tells us over and over again, whether you're treating diabetes, depression as an individual therapist, healthcare, mental health, make sure that you are on the same page with your client or your patient about what you're working on and track progress. Okay, so we have found that being outcomes-based, setting goals, identifying priority needs, and tracking progress is probably the biggest practice level thing that you can do to achieve positive outcomes. But other things that have popped out are being strengths-based and making sure that you're connecting that family to community and natural supports. All those 10 principles, if there are 3 to really hammer on, being outcomes-based, focusing on strengths, and connecting the family to community and natural supports. That's actually about 4 of the 10 principles. So what does it take to actually achieve those kinds of, that high fidelity? What we have found is there's 2 keys. One, training and coaching of staff, and the second thing is making sure that your program or community is actually supporting wraparound. This is our little diagram that we use to show how important it is if you want to have an effective wraparound team. It's unlikely to happen if you do not have a supportive organization that's providing good training, supervision, working well with other organizations and systems, collaborating with other systems, making sure that you are collaborating with the service providers out there. Remember that wraparound care coordinators are not intended necessarily to be doing therapy or providing the service. You better be good collaborators with all the people out there and know who the service providers are that are going to get your family better outcomes. So we need supportive organizations, and we need a hospitable system. We need the funding and the policies in the system to align with good wraparound practice at the practice level. Otherwise, you're going to have facilitators who are terribly burned out because they're always pushing that big rock uphill trying to get good plans of care in place for the families, getting people to show up for meetings and so forth. So we think it's pretty important that you are focusing on the program and system supports that you need to actually get better outcomes and better fidelity. Community partnership, these are the kind of questions that you need to ask. If you ever run a wraparound type program out there in the community someday, or just participating in one, ask yourself, do we have collaboration across our systems and stakeholders? Do those stakeholders actually work together to make sure that policies and practices are supportive of the wraparound model? Are caseloads low enough for facilitators? Do you have access to flexible funds? Do the system partners know that they might be called upon to be part of a wraparound team? That's all about community partnership and collaborative action. Fiscal policies are critical. I already talked about the service array. Do wraparound teams have access to services and supports that they need to meet families' needs? And that includes youth and family peer support, but also effective clinical services like cognitive behavioral therapy or multisystemic therapy, mentoring, school-based services, and so forth. Human resource development, I already said that this is one of the two big things. I call it out because it's so critical. Do we have the right caseloads and working conditions, and are people supported with coaching and training and supervision? That's going to be the focus of an entire week of our course, led by Dr. Matarese. And then finally, again, you know, this is my thing, accountability. Are we using tools to make sure that we're doing a good job with one family or an initiative of hundreds of families? This is a summary of the types of program and system supports that we think are necessary to achieve this kind of mutually reinforcing factors for wraparound teamwork. I am going to sum up by talking about, let's go ahead and skip this, okay? Here's our summary. I've already kind of made these points. We need those program and system supports. Again, wraparound host organizations that have good supervisors, doing good supervision, low caseloads, good training, coaching, and quality assurance. This is the kind of stuff that gets us to a clear theory and research-based wraparound service model. And it's that we think gets to healthier, happier families, regardless of the level of complexity of the needs of the young people. So, again, thanks for being with me this week. I'm going to sum up some of the major points in a slightly different way now. My wife is a biologist. When she does PowerPoints, I'm always very envious because she's able to show pictures of really cute animals and rivers and streams and things like that. And I'm always just showing, you know, the best I can do is get a picture of a cute mother and child or aunt and child or whatever, and show data, right? So here's our take-home points in a slightly different way. So first off, when you're out there talking about wraparound and doing this work in your career, make sure you're promoting the positive. What do we know works? Reference the research base. Talk about what basic theory there is out there about teamwork and about human nature, and why it is that we need to look to that basic research and use it in whatever services we implement. So reference the research base on the theory and why it's based on basic research, on the positive outcomes that have been found out there for both child, youth, and family outcomes as well as costs. And research on the system and practice level fidelity that's needed to achieve those outcomes. Second main point, avoid drift. What is drift? It means that you're drifting away from the program model that we know works. Make sure that you're holding your own superiors accountable. And when you're in a position of supervision or management, make sure that you're setting clear expectations in job descriptions, hiring, and supervision. Measure implementation and outcomes to keep yourself on track, and set up systems for data-driven coaching and supervision. These are ways to avoid drifting away from the intended wraparound model. See the forest and the trees. This is a really silly joke. Anyways, the point here is make sure you're attending to the systems that support wraparound implementation. The service array, the community oversight and community collaboration, training and coaching, and collect data at an individual family and system level. You need to actually pay attention to those trees as well as the forest of the wraparound principles and what we're trying to achieve. And again, focus on what matters. Regardless of what model you use or what trainers you're using, make sure that your staff or you as a practitioner are setting goals and monitoring progress, maintaining a strengths perspective, and doing whatever you can to connect youth and families to community and natural supports. And with that, I will say goodbye for week 6 from our Wraparound and Systems of Care class. I look forward to seeing your discussion board posts. And don't forget, if you want to get a bonus point, reference the Wraparound Theory of Change as part of your description of what kind of research you would like to conduct out there on Wraparound. Thanks very much. And don't forget, your midterms are due at the end of this week as well.